Welcome back to Tiny Grimes Games, and I'm here with another Keyforge video, and today I bring you 7 keys for understanding whether or not you have a good deck. That is, if your deck has the 7 assets, the 7 facets described here, you should be well on your way. Okay, number 1 is to be able to make amber outside of reaping, fighting, outside of actually using your board. Essentially, making amber from hand. There are actually a lot of ways to do this. One is just play cards, like here's one here, Radiant Truth. Pretty good, controls the board by stunning each enemy creature not on flank. It gets you an amber. There's the Sanctum card that just gives you 3 amber. There are tons and tons and tons of cards that just give you amber. Play a Dust Pixie, bam, 2 amber. The more cards you have like this, the less dependent you are on actually using your board, and the more you're able to just say, I don't care what you do to my board, it doesn't matter what's on the board, I can play for my hand and get the amber I need. Okay, the next thing you want to look for are come into play effects. Again, this is the same thing that I was just talking about. You won't often be able to use your board, so putting 2 creatures from each house on the board that don't have come into play effects and don't have awesome static effects isn't actually all that great. But when you have cards that have come into play effects, things get a lot more powerful. So a good example of this might be the Hunting Witch. Yes, she doesn't do anything amazing when she comes into play, but if you can play a Hunting Witch and 2 other creatures, well, suddenly you're going to have a really good situation where not only are you populating the board, but you're doing other things as well. Another example could be something like Old Bruno, who, yeah, he's not amazing, but he does have elusive, and when he comes in, he captures 3, so he slows your opponent down, and he's doing stuff. So in other words, yeah, you have Old Bruno on the board, maybe you never use him even once, but guess what? When he came into play, he did something quite powerful and useful. Alright, next is cards that let you do stuff out of turn, and there are all kinds of amazing cards like this. One example is the Dominator Bauble. When you're using your Dis House, you can activate other creatures on the board. There's a really good card out of Logos that's an event that lets you play 1 card of any outside house from your hand. So you can declare Logos, play the 4 Logos cards, and then boom, drop a Bait and Switch or some other amazing card that you are looking at. There's also a whole bunch of stuff with Omni effects, a bunch of artifacts. One great example of this is Key to Dis. It has an Omni effect, which basically means you can play it whenever you want. So you can do things like play the Key to Dis and then repopulate the board with, say, Untamed creatures. So there's a lot of cards like this, but the more cards you have that give you that flexibility to play cards out of house so that you can play stuff when it's not the house that you declared, the more powerful your deck is going to be. Another thing that you just have to be able to do to some degree is control your opponent's amber. Now this is a lot easier if you're something like House Shadows. You can drop an Urchin in, just play, steal 1, boom. You can do something crazy if they get out of control and bait and switch and take a whole bunch of them. But there are a lot of other ways to do it that aren't quite as powerful but are still really useful. For example, the capture mechanic. So Old Bruno comes into play, captures 3. A really easy usage of this is something like Sir Francis, who he can just fight and capture 1 when he defeats someone. I'm spacing on the guy. The Logos character, that's strength 3, that just comes into play, captures 1. Just that 1 will often slow people down just enough to be able to get there. And it seems like every house has a way to capture 1, to steal 1. It doesn't have to be Shadows where you're stealing all of them, just enough to kind of slow them down, slow them down, slow them down, so that if they want to make a key for sure, they need to get 7, 8, 9, and then especially if you're Shadows, then they're dealing with bait and switch. And so any way you have to control them and slow them down a little bit is going to work really well. Another thing that I think will make your deck very strong is if you have a card that lets you make keys out of the key phase. There are a number of cards that do this. I currently have the Doomwind deck open as sort of the demonstration for us, and I'll talk about this in a minute. But it doesn't have one. It doesn't have a key charge or some other way to do that. Key charge is an untamed event that lets you do that. But these cards are incredibly powerful and lets you play around things like the steal mechanic. Like it just said, you want to be able to control your opponent's amber. Well, if you have a way to, yes, they're going to control it, but now you have 6 or 7 for key charge, which you need. You can just make your key and it doesn't matter if they can control it. I was able to use that to great effect today, and I think those cards are going to be really key. All right, you need cards that disrupt your opponent's plans. There are a lot of cards that can do really cool things like that. One of them is Lash of Broken Dreams, make their keys cost 3 more. There is the Succubus that makes it so that they, you know, can't draw up as much. There is the discard that discards a card from their hand. All kinds of stuff. Hysteria, return all the creatures to people's hands. You need some sort of methods of messing with your opponent's plans. A big one is board wipes. Board wipes are really good. There are a lot of good board wipes. Mars has one that does 3 damage to all creatures on the board. One of my favorites is the one that returns 2 cards from each side to the deck. So if you have a good come into play effect, you can cycle that. Basically, you have to be able to disrupt your opponent's plans. You can't just walk along and hope things go well. Another key you want to have for your deck is cards that help you with future turn sculpting. The best way to do this is archiving through Logos. You can do the craziest things when you can, you know, archive 4 cards into your archive pile, then pick them up, and suddenly you're dropping 8 on your opponent and doing crazy things. Archives is an incredibly powerful way to sculpt future turns. But like I said, a lot of these other effects like Dominator Bobble is another good way to sculpt your future turns. Knowing that you're going to have these Omni effects that let you do or make these moves at a later point in the game. Those are all incredibly powerful. All right, the last one I'm going to throw out there, number 8, even though it said 7, it's 8. Now it's 8. Is you want to have creatures that have really good static effects. Because what this does for you is it makes it so that your opponent has to address these creatures. Yeah, you may never call House Dis again, but if Succubus is on the board, it doesn't matter. Succubus is still doing work, making it so they draw up 1 less. Mother is another great card from Logos, which lets you draw 1 more. That's incredibly powerful. There is a 2-power disc creature that makes it so your opponents can only play 2 cards per turn. That is a must remove immediately. Its static effect is super strong. Another one which we saw already is Hunting Witch. That has to be removed right away. The more creatures you have on the board that have these amazing static effects, the more it forces your opponent to make plays they didn't want to have to make. They didn't want to have to play the 1/2 damage card they had in Shadows because it was their only Shadows card, but you dropped a Hunting Witch and they went, oh my goodness, if I don't remove the Hunting Witch, are they going to drop 4 creatures next turn? They feel like they have to remove the Hunting Witch. It's the same thing with all these other static creatures. It really makes them feel like they have to be resolved because you don't even have to declare the house for them to do something great. Okay, so these are 8 tips, 8 keys for knowing, is my deck good or not? Let's look at real quick this Doomwind deck in action to kind of see why it is so good. We're going to go through every one of the cards and talk about, does it satisfy one of the things we talked about? So Hunting Witch certainly does. Old Bruno, it has a come into play effect that messes with their stuff. Lash of Broken Dreams messes with their plans, their keys cost more. Succubus, great static effect that messes with their plans. Hysteria messes with their plans, maybe messes with your plans, but sends it back to hand. You can do all kinds of cool stuff. You send back your 2 Hunting Witches and a bunch of other creatures. Now you drop them all next turn. Dominator Bobble lets you play stuff out of turn, lets you sculpt turns. Key to Dis lets you play stuff out of turn. Urchin, a great come into play effect. Bait and Switch, messing with their stuff. Deal 2 to each creature and making amber, so it's both of these. I think we're seeing why this deck is so good. The Dust Pixie comes into play 2. Amazing. Hand of Dis, destroy a creature. That's messing with their plans. The funny thing is Hand of Dis is one of the lesser quality cards in this deck, but it's still really strong. It has another Hunting Witch, which is absurd. Let's just go through here. What's this next card? Arise! This lets you sculpt a future turn, or even do incredibly busted things this turn, where you are, you know, they removed those static effect creatures, or they removed whatever it is that was great. You arise, you get it back, you plunk it back down. Even something as lame looking as Murmuk is really good. Your opponent's got to 6, whoop, you drop it. Now they have to get 7. It just slows them down that one more turn. Oh, and this deck did have Key Charge. I just didn't even realize it. It has Key Charge, so now you're getting to make stuff out of turn. It has Nexus, is one of those creatures that doesn't satisfy anything we talked about. It doesn't have a great come into play effect. It doesn't have a static effect, but it has at least, like, if you're not going to have these things, having a really strong Reap or Fight is the next best thing, and this is a pretty darn good Reap effect. Using an opponent's artifact is really strong because you use it and you exhaust it before they can use it. One of the few creatures that's not great is Flaxia, but sometimes it's amazing and you get to Amber depending on how it works out. Again, here's another creature that's not great. No steal, no play effect. A fight steal one is okay. It might mess with their stuff just enough. Another creature that I really don't like is the Terror. It's unlikely they're going to have none unless it's really early. That card's not very good. But here we go with an Omni effect. This card is amazing. At any point you can use this creature. Nerve Blast is another one of these really good cards where it has a play effect of stealing 1. And then it also does 2 just for the heck of it. These cards, these upgrades are usually not that great. But the fact that it gives you an Amber, to me, makes it good. It satisfies that requirement of wanting to have, being able to get Amber outside of having to use your board. So Flame Wreath and Way of the Bear both satisfy that, even though they're not amazing. Vigor is another card that it's pretty good. Like, usually healing 3 damage from a creature is not going to make or break you. But being able to get potentially 2 Amber from hand is really strong. Pawn Sacrifice, same kind of thing. You can remove those creatures, those static effect creatures, while gaining an Amber. That's very strong. Shadow Self is one of these creatures that has a pretty good static effect. So if you're able to put some stealing guys next to him, it makes it so that while normally they wouldn't be that great, they're more protected by Shadow Self, so you don't feel compelled to be like, well, I have to use that house because I just put some guys out and they're going to get killed soon. Not really. Shadow Self makes it so that they may last quite a bit longer. Fear is another one of these cards that's really good for messing with your opponent's plans, especially if they have that one card out that you know is going to do quite a bit. Next turn, you just bounce to the hand, and it's no big deal. A card that I don't really like that much, that I think other people do, is Ancient Bear, because it doesn't have a great static effect. It has no static effect. It doesn't have a come into play effect. It doesn't have a fight effect. It doesn't have a reap effect. It's just a big body that can like break through elusive. And while that's fine, I don't want to have to declare Untamed and attack with the Ancient Bear to get something from him. And the same is true with the Niffle Ape. Sure, he can attack and do something, but he doesn't disrupt them by stealing. All he's doing is basically handling their board, so I consider that to be not a very good card. Relentless Whispers is another one of these cards where you get an amber just for dealing damage, maybe get more amber. So I think looking through this, we can see why we consider this Doomwind deck to be pretty much the best deck that we have so far, because it's almost all the cards in the deck satisfy what I'm talking about. One of these 8 keys, almost every card does. And what's scary is there's a whole bunch that don't, which means this deck has room to be quite a bit better, and this deck crushes all of our current decks that we have. So that to me is a little terrifying, that this deck has room to actually improve. Oh my goodness. Alright, well, those are 7 asterisk, maybe 8 keys to understanding whether or not you have a good deck. I think this is one of the most important things, is when you open your deck, being able to look through it and say, how do I know if this is a good deck other than playing it over and over? I think this will help you follow those keys, and you'll know whether you have a great deck right out of the gate. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you next time on Tiny Grimes Games.